Today we have the next in the series of these special Veterans Recognition programs. And to introduce today's speaker and the subject of post-traumatic stress disorder, please join me in welcoming to our microphone a great Rotarian, Randy Revelle.
Thank you and good afternoon. Almost 3 years ago, in June of 2004, I appeared before you to tell my personal story of experiencing and recovering from a serious mental illness known as bipolar disorder. I also discussed the challenges of overcoming the awful stigma of mental illness and the importance of telling the truth about living with a mental illness. During my presentation, I emphasized that unfortunately mental illness has become the most common health problem in America today. Almost 1/2 of adult Americans will experience a mental illness at some time in their life. 1 in 5 Americans has a diagnosable mental illness at any one time. 1 in 10 Americans is living with a serious mental illness. These numbers are tragic and disturbing. Even more tragic and disturbing is the number of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans coping with a mental illness. As of June 2006, about 1 in 3 of the more than 184,000 Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans who have sought health care from the Veterans Health Administration have been diagnosed with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, known as PTSD, or other mental disorders. That's 61,000 veterans. The mistreatment of wounded veterans at the renowned Walter Reed Army Medical Center has triggered numerous accounts of bleak conditions and neglect at military centers worldwide. We read stories of callous responses to the stress of combat and a system poorly equipped to handle psychologically scarred veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Today I'm honored to introduce Dr. Marcus Nemuth, who will tell us the truth about the mental health challenges facing our veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq. The original title of Dr. Nemuth's remarks was Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Was General Patton Wrong? Dr. Nemuth has expanded his original presentation, so the current title is From Battlefront to Homefront, What Now? Let me note an interesting historical coincidence. My father, Judge George H. Revelle, Jr., served on General Patton's staff during 1942 and 1943 when Patton landed at Casablanca and led the 3rd Division across North Africa and Sicily. My father told many fascinating stories about Patton, including when he apologized to his troops for slapping a soldier who we now think may have suffered from PTSD. Dr. Nemuth works for the Veterans Affairs Puget Sound Healthcare Systems as Medical Director of the Psychiatry Emergency Service and as ER Director of the Mental Health Disaster Task Force. He's also a member of the Behavioral Sciences faculty at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He has extensive training and national experience in the prevention and management of violence and the mental health consequences of PTSD, trauma, and terrorism. He also served with the Disaster Medical Assistance Team after Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi. Fellow Rotarians and guests, get ready for an emotional roller coaster. I believe that his remarks will educate, energize, shock, and inspire you. You will also be ashamed of how our government has been treating or neglecting veterans who are crippled physically and mentally while risking their lives for our country. Dr. Nemuth, thank you.
Thank you, Randy Revelle. That was beautifully said. And thank you, Dave Endicott, for helping me get here to speak. It's a real privilege to be talking with you all today. I have become immersed and passionate about our troops in Iraq and our returning Iraq freedom veterans. This has always been in my heart, but I'm now seeing in the emergency room 6 to 10 Iraq freedom veterans per week. Operation Iraqi Freedom, we're on the 4th anniversary. Enduring Freedom began in 2001. Over 1.5 million military personnel have deployed, 95% of them in Iraq. What this means is that at any one time we have, at the current level, 150,000 troops in country, but 1.5 million have rotated through during this combat. That means that 1.5 are at risk for having physical trauma or mental health trauma. This is essentially a tsunami of medical need. I don't know what it's like now to be able to do it properly. A tsunami of need for skilled medical care, which is beginning to hit us. Over 600,000 have demobilized, which means that they're on inactive status. They are at risk for being redeployed. I did not know that the ratio between active duty and reserve National Guards is about 50-50. That's surprising to me. 1.5 million rotated through. In the entire Vietnam conflict, 3 million rotated through. We're halfway there. Women make up 16% of our force. They're at risk for particular types of illness, and unfortunately a high rate of military sexual trauma, which is being addressed actually in a fairly aggressive fashion. 25% of our forces are made up of ethnic minorities. I know that we will look at these not as numbers but as souls. Over 3,000 Americans have been killed. 50,000 are severe traumatized casualties who are disabled to the point where they're evac'd and cannot return to active duty. This is a critical issue in the Iraq conflict. The ratio of killed to gravely disabled by wounds, including mental health issues, is 18 severely injured and evac'd for every single death. There's never been a ratio of that sort in a modern war. In Vietnam, there were 3 major physical traumas for every death. That is one reason why this number for some folks will seem low, although tragic, but in fact, our total number of folks who will need care and who are essentially out of commission is much larger. Medical care needs, you will notice this number is half of the 50,000. The Department of Defense about 12 weeks ago changed the casualty accounting mechanism on their website. Essentially the number dropped to half. What they're saying in part is that if one dies in a hospital setting stateside, you're not counted as KIA, killed in action. 20% have suffered brain trauma, 20% amputations, usually multiple amputations, 40% have been diagnosed with a mental health condition, primarily PTSD. Let's look at the issue of amputations. 20% of this lower number is 5,000 individuals with multiple amputations and polytrauma, which means injury to multiple body systems. We're going to look quickly at a series of photographs that are disturbing. I hope they don't cause undue distress amongst us. I thought it was important to see a visual image of what it's like on the ground in Iraq for our troops, and to understand in a very small sense the traumatizing elements of this combat. This is an explosion of an IED, improvised explosive device. These clouds are a shock wave, blast wave, which carries out for hundreds of yards on either side. It's traveling at 150 to 200 miles an hour. A soldier who's standing at the periphery, who may not be hit by shrapnel, is hit by a huge concussive wave. We now understand that most of those soldiers develop some minor or more severe bleeding in their brain, which is now called traumatic brain injury. This is the factory up-armored Humvee that was in that explosion. 5 souls died in this attack. 1 survived. That is a horrible statistic. However, 150 soldiers witnessed this attack and were fearful for their own lives and felt helpless to intervene, which is one of the primary risk factors for developing PTSD. Body parts had to be cleaned up. So this is a traumatizing experience for many more than those killed. This is the 1 surviving soldier. We now have rapid response forward deployed trauma teams. This individual is getting medic care within 30, 45 minutes of the attack. It's very simple. Their bleeding is stopped or controlled. Their respiration and cardiac function is maintained, and they're shipped. He'll be out of there in less than an hour. They're loaded onto military transport, medical transport airplanes, flown to Luncheon Medical Center, located in Germany, as you know. When Luncheon is on overflow because they're full, there are other regional hospitals that take care of our acutely medical and psychiatric casualties. This is a much more higher level surgical intervention at Luncheon. These are 3 enormously well-trained trauma surgeons working on different parts of the same soldier. These wounds are essentially shredded, and there are no civilian trauma that compares with this situation. You'll also never see 3 trauma surgeons working feverishly on the same individual. This is the stump revision or the below-the-knee amputation that they're able to accomplish. This is superb. It doesn't get better than that. Remember that we have between 5,000 and 10,000 of our veterans who are in this need for ongoing medical rehab and psychiatric care. They're airlifted from Luncheon to major U.S. military treatment facilities, which include Brooke Army Medical Center, specializes in burns, Camp Pendleton Navy Hospital, Madigan, Walter Reed. Within 72 hours, they're getting expert medical care in a stateside medical facility. This beautiful young woman, who now is a veteran, was in a VBD, vehicle-borne explosive device event. She has now undergone 30 surgeries to achieve this wonderful result in ability to use our prosthetics. Yes, these are the most sophisticated and advanced prosthetics in the world. Carbon fiber, titanium, computer chip implanted. However, this young woman will never recover what she expected to be the future of her life. She has surgeries from shrapnel wounds, burns we can't see. She also has traumatic brain injury, which means her cognitive and emotional functioning is impaired lifelong. And what other illness does she have, which will be with her forever? Post-traumatic stress disorder. War changes one's life. For physically and psychologically disabled young veterans and families, the simple hopes and dreams of a normal life will need to be reshaped into a new picture of the future. This takes help. The number one thing our returning young veterans want is to return to a job and to reestablish a family setting. Post-traumatic stress disorder, well, we know more about this illness in the United States, particularly in the VA system, than anyone in the world. We learned about PTSD on the backs of Vietnam veterans. We have a little better treatment than in the Civil War when these individuals were shot. PTSD is a biologic and psychological reaction to prolonged exposure or participation in combat, civilian trauma, man-made or natural disaster, higher level of PTSD, civilian violence such as rape also. I mentioned that this illness and medical psychiatric condition is not due to a personal weakness. I can't overemphasize that. Any of us experiencing this level of trauma have a high likelihood of developing PTSD. This triad of syndromes is the central explanation of PTSD clinical response. These individuals have re-experiencing the traumatic event. They cannot get images of the trauma out of their mind. They have flashbacks where they actually believe they are back in the combat setting. They have a high level of avoidance. They become isolated and withdrawn. Many of them, if they were in a vehicle explosion setting, will go into a panic attack when they see a car pass by, fearful that it contains explosives. Hyperarousal is the biologic component of PTSD. It represents an elevated level of adrenaline, which is continuous. Their neurotransmitter level has been reset. We see a snake, kill the snake, and our adrenaline goes back to a normal level. For these individuals, adrenaline and other neurochemicals remain at a very high level. I saw this patient, Bill, 10 days ago in my emergency room, served multiple tours. He was in a firefight. As he fired, and a surgeon grabbed a 5-year-old girl as a human shield. She died in his arms. He will never be without an intense and continuous memory and post-traumatic stress of this experience. He asked for counseling in the field, was unable to get it. Returns home, wife, 2 children, has violent outbursts and increased startle response. His wife announces herself when she hears him coming around a corner, because if he sees her unexpectedly, he will assault her, thinking that she is an enemy combatant. Brought to our emergency room after some very gentle and supportive time, usually with me. He expresses himself as feeling emotionally dead. He has a suicide plan, a weapon at home. I admit him to the hospital where he gets acute PTSD treatment and will have acute follow-up. Dan, also about 10 days ago, witnessed his best friend killed in a convoy explosion, felt helpless to intervene. This is one of the highest risk factors for developing PTSD. He bagged and transported body parts. Some of them assuredly were his buddy. Stateside, nightmares, flashbacks, fearful of vehicles, anger outbursts, can't work, and drinks to blackout. He drinks to blackout in order to stop these continuous images of his combat trauma. He did not have an alcohol problem prior to combat. He has difficulty talking initially in the emergency room, sobs, and many times these soldiers, men and women, once they let down, their story pours out of them in excruciating detail. Dan accepts referral to our post-deployment clinic, which I can get him into the same day, or certainly in 24 hours, goes to alcohol treatment, I start him on a medication for sleep. The war at home. The suicide rate issue is very important to understand. It's like the canary in the mine shaft. This information has been denied by the Department of Defense vigorously. 2 weeks ago, the Annals of Internal Medicine came out with a beautifully done scientific study, excellent methodology, peer-reviewed, which incontrovertibly showed that for every 100,000 of our troops in country and immediately upon return, 19 of them complete suicide. This is an overall measure of how severe the mental health distress and trauma is in the field. Levels of unemployment and homelessness are much higher than their measurable disability would explain. There's something going on here that we need to learn more about. Veterans make up 23% of our homeless population, 4% are women. At any one night in Seattle-King County, there'll be 8,000 homeless, 2,000 on our streets, and 23% of them are veterans. How did this happen? Inadequate planning and budgeting is a big part. This is not finger-pointing, but it's very important to know how we got here so we can make it better. Dr. Murphy, God bless her, the VA Undersecretary for Health Policy, her Veterans Affairs Undersecretary, stated serious risk that the VA, already overwhelmed, would be unable to meet medical and mental health needs of a large wave of returning veterans. This was at the same time that Secretary of the VA, James Nicholson, testified that the VA is fully capable of handling anything that we need to. These three items are agreed by experts to be important places to begin making changes rapidly. We have trouble moving soldiers from Department of Defense into the VA. There's a term called seamless transition. Believe me, it is not seamless. In the VA, they are able to make disability claims. As I said, 18 months backlogged. We need a much larger level of highly trained and skilled medical and psychiatric personnel to meet the needs. A promise was made to care for our young men and women fighting in uniform, both when they are in harm's way and when they return home. Fulfilling this promise is not philanthropic, it is a duty. It needs to start with unit commanders in the field, and our culture needs to change so that there is a spiritual understanding that we are all responsible for seeing that this promise is met in the best fashion possible in the field and at home. Thank you very much, and I don't know if we have time for questions.
That was fabulous. Well, we have two options. We can either be out of time or we can take a couple questions. I'd like to go with Plan B and take a couple questions. Donna Lee.
Doctor, the medical community tells us now that many veterans returned from World War II with PTSD and were never treated. Given the barriers that you mentioned to getting treatment, acknowledging that one needs treatment, and the need for, as you say, a cultural change, why don't we start with a presumption of PTSD and work from there, given that 40% apparently have PTSD?
Excellent point and suggestion. Certainly those in the mental health field, both within the VA and in the community and academic setting, know that we're going to see a level of perhaps exceeding 40% PTSD in our young men and women, and that's why we need to ramp up and should have already been doing this in order to be able to provide a much higher level of mental health as well as medical care, both in rehab, mental health treatment and lifelong care, which is estimated to cost up to $600 billion for the duration of these individuals' lives. I see World War II vets who are at their end of stage life, and it's an enormous privilege to talk with them. And many of them have gone through their whole life with post-traumatic stress disorder and had impairments in their family life, work life, and their internal spiritual well-being that have never been addressed. So you're right, this has occurred in every war. There's some elements of the Iraq conflict that make it somewhat unique, but thank you. Great.
Given what these young men and women are exposed to, could PTSD be a healthy reaction?
That is a wonderful and thoughtful question. My associate and dear friend, Colonel Elspeth Ritchie, who works at Bethesda Naval Hospital as well as the Pentagon, said that exact thing, that war causes mental health distress. This is true. Nonetheless, if we can intervene and make the disabling elements of this non-adaptive response to their traumatic experience better, so that their likelihood of employment, family life, and an ongoing future is better, we should do that. The adaptive mechanism or response to a trauma in combat is what happens with the other 50% of our combatants. They are distressed, will be troubled forever by what they experienced, but they do not become dysfunctional, and that's the difference.
One last question. Faith.
My point is, I didn't see any statistics there about how many fall into not homelessness but prison or jail systems, and I think that you must count that number with our vets based on my experience with the criminal justice system.
Absolutely. A number of these individuals fall into the jail system primarily because they're not acting the way other people do. Yes, they become combative, they become substance abusers, and essentially the jail becomes their mental health treatment locus. We have an outreach program to contact and support veterans who are in jail, which recently has had its funding cut. Those of us, many of us, hope that that'll be restored. This is a big problem.
Thank you, Dr. Nemuth. It is good. Sorry for having to deal with the adversity. Thank you, Doctor, for caring for our veterans. I'd like to ask all the veterans in the room to please stand up. I'm proud of you all. Which brings us to this week's pretty good rule. It's hard to be truly humble, which is mystifying when you consider how much we have to be humble about. See you next week. We are adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from Enterprise Seattle. For over 35 years, Enterprise Seattle has provided client-based economic development services to businesses throughout King County and its 39 cities. More information on Enterprise Seattle and how they help businesses grow and prosper can be found at www.enterpriseseattle.org. And by First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.